Okay, today I'm going to talk about victim politics, and I'm going to argue that it's one of the most powerful forces in history, and it affects both the way we see the world as individuals, but also the way that social groups see the world. If you think about it, for instance, most religions and wars rely on a victim identity. For instance, Christians often wear a cross representing a scene of victimization. Most religions have martyrs, people who've been sacrificed or who have sacrificed for their cause. And when you have a victim identity based group, you often have a division between we are good and the other is evil. And also, once you have this division between the good and the evil, and it's centered on victim suffering and victim identity, then often revenge is justified. So many wars start with one group claiming that they're a victim, and then they argue that their vengeance and aggression is justified. So, at the foundation of the victim fantasy structure is this notion that the victim is innocent and pure, that there's a clear distinction between good and evil, and that you're not allowed to criticize the victim, and that the victim's revenge is justified. And this works through a form of emotional manipulation. Now, I want to be very clear. I'm not saying there aren't real victims in the world and in history, but what we want to look at is the way that victim identity is used in order to create a sense of self identity and also to create a relationship with other people. So we need psychoanalysis to understand victim identity and victim politics because the victim fantasy is unconscious, meaning the people who are using it are often unaware of what they're doing. It's often irrational in the sense that it brings together both real and imagined ideas and representations, and is often indirect, meaning it's often using symbols and indirect communication. And these are all central to psychoanalysis. So, one example is the right, the political right, the right wing, often represent themselves as victim of taxes, of government regulation, and of political correctness. And there is this cultural opposition set up between the right wing id, the right wing impulses, free speech, free market, versus the superego left. And in this structure, the superego is externalized and projected onto the left. And we see this through the representation of cancel culture, guilt, and shame. Um, what we'll see is that there's actually this relationship that connects the left to the right. In some sense, they need each other. So the left plays the role of the external superego that the right tries to escape from, tries to liberate itself from, and tries to find its freedom by denouncing the superego left. On the same hand, we'll see that cancel culture um, and the guilty and shaming of people for their thoughts and ideas and feelings is often enacted by the left. You think of someone, though, like Trump, what he really represents is what we can call victim reversal. So instead of the poor being the victims of society or people of color being the victims of society, Trump feeds into this idea that it's like the white male Christian who is the true victim. And as Thomas Frank wrote, this idea of pitying the billionaire, that we should feel sorry for the oppressed billionaire who has to pay taxes and who can't say what he wants to say. And the reverse of this is also, or the inverse, is the idea of welfare queens. So, like the people on welfare are the true powerful people, and you have this kind of inverted structure where the people who have really been oppressed by society or the people who are in need are seen as the true controllers, and the people who are really in control are seen as the victims. So on the left, what we often find is the group rallies around a sense of victim identity. And once again, this can be based on true or imagined scenes of victimization. And because of their victim identity, they seek to make others feel guilt and shame. And their victim identity is often related to some type of trauma or traumatic roots, like historical roots, and often generalized to talk about systemic oppression. Once again, this can be real and imagined. Um, and often there is what Freud called a hysterical identification. That is, people bond over their shared suffering, their shared victimization. And so we see this, for instance, in the idea of like me too. I'm also suffering. Um, and this can result in both rational and irrational responses, like the idea of abolish the police. We can argue like the police need major reform, but the idea of abolish the police kind of shows how this type of victim identity often leads to exaggeration or extreme responses. So in between these two types of victimization of the left and the right, we often also have liberal victimization. And I'm going to use the example of liberal professors. And so there often is when professors talk about problems in higher education, the first thing they often do is talk about um, they want to blame the state, like defunding of higher education, which is a real problem, evil administrators, the right-wing attack on higher education, or global capitalism, neoliberalism. And one idea here is that instead of looking at their own role within their institutions and within institutional inequality and hierarchy, they want to escape any sense of guilt and shame, and they want to focus on their good intentions. And this often results in what people call virtue signaling. Um, they not only want to avoid conflict, but part of like the narcissism of liberalism is this need to have the good self recognized by others. And so, but underlying in the university structure and in many liberal institutions, you have this conflict between hierarchy and equality. On one hand, they will argue that they want equality, they want justice, they want fairness. They are also highly invested in hierarchy. So we see this in this idea of the meritocracy. With professors, for instance, there's always ranks, and the colleges are always ranked, and everything is graded, and everything is evaluated. And so there really is this underlying conflict between the desire for hierarchy and the desire for equality. So they want to hide their investment in status and hierarchy by proclaiming their good intentions and virtue signaling. And this often means like appeasing the left. And we can think of like one of the signs that the system doesn't work is the use and exploitation of adjunct faculty and graduate student instructors. We see them as a symptom of the underlying exploitation that is denied by the professors seeking to highlight their virtues and good intentions. So it's important to realize that these social structures, these political ideologies that I'm attaching to victim identification also relate to individuals. So at first, Freud thought that all of his female patients were really assaulted sexually by their fathers. And then he came up with the notion that some of them might have only fantasized about being assaulted. And so then he had to think about why would people imagine being victims? Why would they imagine assault? And there's several reasons for this. One is that by suffering or having an illness, you can be excused from social obligations. If you're a victim, you can blame other people for all of your problems, and therefore you can escape guilt and shame. In fact, he said, we're driven by the pleasure principle, which is the desire to escape all mental and physical tension. And so by blaming others, we can escape guilt and shame, which causes anxiety and tension. And key to this is the idea of repression, that what creates the unconscious for Freud is self-deception, so that people want to protect their self-image, their image of being good or being pure or being virtuous. And they do this through self-deception, but also by creating fantasies of abuse that are that serve the purpose of blaming others for all of their problems and issues and difficulties. So the question is, what is the cure for this? Well, the first thing is trying to let go of the victim fantasy frame. People see themselves through the lens of being a victim. And this means that they're not seeing reality. And they're not discovering the truth of their own reality, of their own inner thoughts, of their own inner guilt. So psychoanalysis uses the process of free association, where people are supposed to speak about whatever comes to their mind and therefore discover the truth about their memories and about their feelings and thoughts. This is a form of emotional intelligence that requires radical self-honesty and confronting shame, guilt, and taking responsibility. But it's important to realize that there's no clean hands, as Sartre would say, meaning that we all have guilt, we all have shame, and that the unconscious is formed by us trying to escape our feelings of guilt and shame. And so the question is it possible within the realm of politics and culture to actually confront our guilt and shame and take on responsibility?